AndrewRoot is the Carrie Olson Balson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. He is most recently the author of the 3-volume Ministry in a Secular Age series, and he puts together theology and storytelling to explore how ministry leads us into encounter with divine action.
Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and this session of our wonderful online summit exploring the future of spirituality. I'm joined by my friend, practical theologian, AndrewRoot.
Hey, I'm changing my name on my Zoom so it comes up correctly. There we go. Hey, Trip, great to be with you.
I feel better about that now. Now that your Zoom
now I know who I am
is correct.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that is exciting about this online summit is wrestling with a question like the future of spirituality is really broad, because I'm not even sure we could get two people that are participating to even agree on what spirituality is. But kind of operating from your professional field as a practical theologian, are there kinds of insights or framing devices that you use to make sense of kind of the popular conversation around what spirituality is?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I because I'm a practical theologian, would want to see spirituality obviously as having some deep kind of lived dynamic to it. So how people are making meaning, usually with some kind of sense of transcendence to it. But I think we got to talk about what kind of transcendence that is. I think that there's different kind of ways of seeing that transcendent reality. But what I'm most interested in, and Trip, you and I have had a long conversations about this, but just thinking about how spirituality, or the uptick in spirituality, or like, maybe I should say it this way, I'm a big addict of, I was raised by MTV's The Real World, so all these, you're smirking like you're judging me. It's, but I've watched nearly every episode of The Real World, but also, of course, since Paramount Plus came out, they've had these reunion episodes. So I watched the first reunion, which was of the first season in New York. And one of the amazing things is all these now 50-year-olds came back 30 years since they were on The Real World. And they now all were spiritual. They had all had some kind of spiritual awakening. They had taken some kind of turn away from what they were in the early 90s, as they were kind of driven for, I don't know, something, and kind of lived this more kind of neo-Nietzschean kind of sense of the will to power, and they were going to make something of themselves. And now they were all, I don't know, they were all into mindfulness, and they were all into meditation, and they were all into these spiritual practices. So for me, spirituality has that dynamic of being a very lived reality. And I think spirituality from a kind of perspective of Christian ministry is it's a good thing that this kind of spiritual sensibility has opened up in the last 50 years, I think. But it also makes things confusing, I think, and gives its own challenges.
And when you think of the word spirituality, or people that come back and, they become spiritual and such like that, that language only makes sense in our context today. For a long time, the idea of spirituality being something you may or may not have was always set in the context of a religious tradition. And usually for the last 1,000 years or so, there have been real dominant ones, depending on where you are in the globe, that everyone kind of shared a religious mythopoetic structure, rhythm, rituals, and such. How do you see the question of religion and spirituality's relationship changing in our secular context? Because a lot of the guesses, I think, like if we had guessed what was going to happen to the 50-year-olds that were the original members on MTV of Real World, part of getting real about the world was getting less religious and less spiritual. And yet it's come back around. It's like, how do you diagnose or account for that as a practical theologian?
Yeah, well, two things come to mind. I mean, one is that you know, Tripp, you and I have spent so much time talking about Charles Taylor on your own podcast and things like that. But I am kind of convinced by Taylor's perspective. And sometimes Taylor gets pushback for those who haven't actually read Taylor, because they're like, a secular age. No. This isn't a secular age. Look at the reunion of MTV's you know, first Real World. There's spirituality everywhere. This is a post-secular age. This isn't a secular age. But that's not really what Taylor means. Taylor thinks that inside of this kind of secular age, there is what he calls this kind of nova effect of all sorts of third way spiritualities. And it is he thinks of it as this kind of nova effect. You can kind of get the image here of it's like a star exploding and into all of these third way options. And he thinks that the pressure, the gravity that impinges on this, that it leads to the explosion, are these two kind of forces. It's really this kind of expressivist authenticity drive that one has to find their own most authentic way of being themselves. And then that kind of collides with organized religion. And inside the tensions between this kind of drive for authenticity or a certain kind of expressivism, this in organized religion, in many ways, I like to think that like organized religion after, and he thinks this is like a late 1960s into 1970s realities when it kind of spills out into our cultural realm, that it really is that organized religions, like you're saying, that those markets become deregulated, to use that kind of crass economic language, where they no longer have they no longer have monopoly, and all these third options come up. So for a lot of people, yoga, or eventually kind of forms of mindfulness, or taking walks with your dog in the woods, all become a kind of form of spirituality. And then of course with the internet, all of this explodes further, and you can find these groups who have all sorts of different belief systems, whether it's UFO groups or whatever. So I think that's part of the reality. But inside of that kind of expressivist authenticity reality, I'm really interested in kind of pushing a little beyond Taylor and thinking about how the kind of performative self inside of neoliberalism demands a certain kind of form of spirituality. So if we think of like the neoliberal epoch coming about in the 80s, you also start to see like in the 1980s and into the 90s, this move towards spirituality. And I think the kind of change in the economic system and the kind of change in how we work particularly brings this kind of spirituality in. And I think there's a link between kind of thinking of ourselves as entrepreneurial selves and then the dynamic of spirituality. And you can look at these companies in a kind of neoliberal age that have turned towards like pseudo spiritualities at work, really to get people to work harder and to give them less protections, less union protections, less kind of pension protections. But the idea is, well, you get to work on yourself at work. And that can even be a spiritual dynamic. And especially if it's a creative endeavor, or if the whole firm is creative, even if you just make copies, but if the firm is creative, then that's a kind of form of spirituality. And so I think it has a lot to do with this kind of sense of the performative self, this kind of new landscape where everyone's their own business and everything is hyperly competitive. And when you're inside a hyperly competitive 24/7 environment, it feels like you need a spirituality to both help you deal with the competition as well as help infuse all the effort with some kind of meaning. And I also think, we could talk about this, that I think is really central, is that I think guilt returns in a pretty significant way. In that I do think that these spiritualities and forms of kind of cultural guilt are interconnected.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now there's a number of
that was a
different
mouthful.
directions.
I apologize.
I know,
yeah.
no, but I'm sitting here and I had 3 different next questions just while you were talking. So I'll just do them in order that they came up. The first one, you talked a bit about how the notion of authenticity reframed, right? How the modern subject understands a spiritual task. And to be formed, right? Like if you hear someone go like, I have a healthy spirituality or spiritual sense of self, it's the word authenticity is coming out in their first paragraph of what that's like. And I think that that's different than how spirituality was expressed when we had when we didn't have a kind of pluralistic context, right? Where then spirituality is expressed as the healthy, vibrant expression of some religious tradition. And so I wonder if the ethics that come around with authenticity for thinking spirituality, how do you see that changing the kind of by osmosis experience of what identity formation is? Like when we think about our identity, how has that spirituality, ethics of authenticity reshaped the task of like coming to own your own identity?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like to me that it's always been a task for every human being to formulate an identity or to have an identity. But to answer that question, who am I, like you're saying, Trip, used to be imposed on you, and that could have been a quite negative, or it could have just happened. And so you did get forms of spirituality, or people who were taking, we would have probably called them, back in the day, mystics. And those mystics usually were kind of pushing in some ways of reforming kind of core religious commitments. Like they were the kind of reformers in those sometimes, or they were a subset within those religious perspectives. But this becomes quite different inside the age of authenticity, because the age of authenticity, like you're saying, has this ethic that says every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. Okay, well, part of the way you do that in a rich way, in not a kind of bland, flat way, is to have a spirituality to it. Like there should be a spirituality in figuring out who you are. And you do have the overall burden that you have to define for yourself what it means for you to be human. So now answering this question, who am I, is not kind of lifted and carried by a community or some other kind of collective. It's completely carried by you, the individual, for the most part. And then there's just a deep sense of authority that connects within that too. Like Taylor will say, that the new authority becomes only follow what speaks to you. Well, I mean, in some ways that opens a door to this kind of broad kind of sense of spirituality as well, is that there should be some kind of feeling. There should be some kind of there should be some kind of ecstatic sense of feeling connected to something. And that just moves us into kind of thinking of that as a kind of form of spirituality. And so, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking a little bit about is just Daniel Bell's classic book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, where he talks about, he writes this book at the end of the 1970s when everything's starting to come undone in this kind of Keynesian economy. And one of the things he says is the cultural contradictions of capitalism is that workers need to act like Puritans at work and hedonists at home. Like, you need to do your work. You need to be very direct. You need to be almost a rationalist at work. But then if the economy is going to work, if this mass society is going to work, you have to put that away and take your kids to Disneyland and go to a movie and get a burger. And you got to kind of be a hedonist at home. And that becomes this kind of cultural contradiction, which is why I think happy hour was such a significant moment back in those Mad Men days, like having a stiff drink before you enter into the hedonist realm, or how you kind of put away the Puritan kind of realities becomes kind of significant. But you can kind of see that the commitment is something bigger than yourself, even in that kind of hedonistic kind of sense of the cultural contradiction, that you need to do your duty and buy to keep America, keep the economy going and beat back the Soviet Union and things like that. But after into the 1980s and beyond, where you have a spirituality explosion, but you also get this deep sense that every part of your life now, the contradiction isn't out there. The contradiction is in here. How you make sense of your own life. How do you compete? How do you perform in a way that wins you the recognition that you need? How do you become your own entrepreneurial self? And it just, that burden, I think, demands a kind of form of spirituality, which is why I think, especially in middle class settings, why most people, when they go through a midlife crisis, it becomes almost a spiritual journey, even if it's kind of like American Beauty spiritual journey, where you stand naked in front of a mirror and start doing drugs and whatever. There's this kind of deep sense that you are kind of searching for some kind of deep form of meaning, and some kind of level of spirituality is needed there, though it usually almost never has much to do with the kind of classic forms of Christianity or really any religious forms. It becomes completely expressivist, I think.
Mm-hmm. In that context, I mean, you've used a number of different descriptors of it, that the neoliberal epoch, the age of authenticity, these kinds of things generate where the spiritual challenge and the spiritual quest, so much of the pressure gets put on the individual.
Yep.
And when you're in a world where most of your relationships, be it at home, how many homes have deeply shared religious commitments across all the members? At work, what are our deeply held commitments? Allegiance to economism, and these type of things. Between pluralism and the way the market creeps into so many of our relational networks, then the individual is tasked with this becoming authentic, becoming spiritual, carving out your own identity. Use the language of expressivist type of spirit, a performative type of authenticity. I wonder, as a theologian, if how would you reflect on just what that weight feels like? Because my experience in talking to individuals, they may recognize that if they're going to have anything, the touch of transcendence anywhere, it becomes a task they have to bear. But that doesn't make it easy and joyful and light. And I wonder if that framing that you hinted at about the neoliberal epoch might, if you draw the connections, point out that maybe a lot of our assumptions about the system being good and life-giving are problematic. Like, how would you negotiate that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the ironies of, you know, the late modern reality that guilt has returned with such really sharp teeth, you know, and I do think that there's a way to think about, and I'm not sure if this is really true, and there's someone who's a better historian than me. I'm a major amateur historian, but would have to draw these connections. But I just wonder if forms of spirituality or forms of mysticism spike when discourses of guilt become high, or kind of cultural forms of guilt. Like I even think of this, like, you know, like in the kind of in Central Europe, when a moneyed economy kind of came about, you get all these new kind of forms of mysticism as people start to wrestle with how you live in a moneyed economy, and can kind of sense that it has certain ways of taking over for God in some sense. But I think this is one of the kind of deep ironies. I mean, it would be a little bit reductionistic, but I think it's somewhat true that we kind of thought from Rousseau on that we were freeing ourselves from forms of guilt. And one of the problems with religion was that religion imposed this guilt on people that they didn't need to have. And, you know, with all the discourses about freedom that kind of sit at the center of modernity, I think one of them was to free people from a religious guilt, that they didn't need to feel guilty anymore. So there was a sense like the framers of the modern age would have thought, my gosh, by the time you're in the 21st century, subjects will not feel guilty at all. I mean, they'll be free from feeling guilt. And yet I think in the late 20th century, here in the 21st century, guilt has returned with just epic force. And I think what's changed, however, is the guilt is not from without. Like, you stand before a holy, just God and God's law, and therefore God judges you, or you can't live up to God's standards in any way. I think it's more diabolical that the new guilt is a guilt to yourself, that you've let yourself down. And this is the kind of Hartmut Rosa stuff, that you could have done more with your time. You could have done something better, but you just didn't have time to do it. If you had more time, you could exercise more. If you had more time, you could have read better books. If you had more time, you could stay up on all the New York Times articles and really know what's going on in Ukraine. If you had more time, you could be a better parent, and you feel just utterly guilty. And I think one of the reasons that spirituality becomes such a significant thing is because we're now living, particularly with middle-classly upward mobile people, who these people feel this deep pinch of guilt, not even pinch, bite of guilt. And you know, so how many bloggers do we have? How many you know, other kind of gurus, starting with Brene Brown, who kind of tells us to forgive ourselves, to allow to give ourselves a break, it's okay to be vulnerable and be okay with that. You know, so there becomes all these kind of thought leaders who are helping us try to kind of forgive ourselves, which is a kind of form of spirituality.
And you mentioned the theorist Hartmut Rosa there. And I think it might be helpful for you to unpack some of that, because this kind of the generation of guilt, like where you are even generating your own guilt about yourself, and then the kind of performance of your guiltiness, be it the way we signal our the ethical commitments we don't know if we can uphold, all sorts of things. But he actually diagnoses the origin of that problem with a kind of time sickness. And one of the things I found really helpful in the way you lay that out, is it not only explains, or at least gives a framework for understanding the individual's spiritual predicament, it also helps us understand why it's so difficult for historic wisdom traditions to communicate, because it's like everything else in the world is working against what all the wisdom traditions collectively say are the habits and networks of relations that help humans thrive. And anyway, so like, what can you kind of unpack his notion of acceleration and time sickness?
Yeah, so he really does think that what modernity means is the continuing speeding up. And it's the speeding up of multiple different things, really for him, three things, which is it's the speeding up of technological change, which of course is obvious, but it's also the speeding up of social change. And then it's just the overall speeding up of the pace of our lives, that it just feels like our lives just keep going faster and faster. And where did the weeks go? And where did the months go? And where did the years go? So this kind of speeding up becomes, he just thinks it is endemic to what it means to be a modern person. And one of the major ramifications of this it's a very complicated in the sense of there's a lot of angles to this, but it feels very obvious too when you read it. You're like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's the problem. But he thinks that what happens in the midst of that speeding up, and this becomes a real spiritual issue, is that we find ourselves alienated from the world itself. And what he thinks happens inside of this continued push to go faster and faster, which is also this kind of fetishizing of growth. Everything needs to grow. We need to grow. We need to grow. We need to grow. You individually, you need to grow. If you're going to really compete in this neoliberal age, if you're going to be a good worker, if you're going to be a successful self, you have to grow. You have to use your time in a certain way. You have to go faster. He says that alienates us. And what it basically does is create the kind of relations we have with the world that are completely instrumentalized. And he just thinks this is true across the West, that nearly every relationship in the West is instrumentalized. And if it's not, there's always this temptation for instrumentalization just to fall upon our relationships. Again, I think that's one of the reasons spirituality comes up, is that no human being can live inside of that instrumentalizing. And so we yearn for something spiritual to get back to kind of a relation to the world that doesn't feel instrumentalized. But of course, this is the tricky, wicked problem, is inside of a neoliberal market economy, spirituality itself can be sold, instrumentalized, and kind of led into growth. And so, I mean, so that's his point, is that that we become alienated really quickly. And he thinks we need a different form of relationship to the world, a different kind of form of relating. And he calls this resonance, which has a kind of deep kind of spirituality sense to it. Though, I think he would say that there's a spirituality to it, but he thinks this is a kind of form of action we can take. But I think, and he doesn't really say this as much, it will cause for some kind of conversion experience in some ways, like in some sense. I mean, it's a big question for people listening to this, is like the forms of spirituality we have. In some ways, we shouldn't denigrate those. It's great that people are reaching for some kind of spirituality, but at another level, to get to a kind of spirituality that might actually save us, that might actually restore our humanity, may mean we need a conversion experience away even from these kind of neoliberal spiritualities that are just trying to appease our guilt and give us a little bit of rest or a little bit of kind of textured meaning to our hectic, busy lifestyles. So that, it's a little bit like the Toy Story thing where Buzz is he flying, or is that just falling with style? And I sometimes think what these forms of spirituality are in our cultural context, if we're not really careful, it's not really flying. They're sold to us like they're flying, but it's really just falling with some kind of style. It's just leading to further forms of alienation with some kind of style to them.
Something that has came to mind, like after our last, for people that don't know, and you're really interested in this conversation, just go find Andy and I spending 6.5 to 2 hour conversations digging into all this. But since then, I've been thinking about something that connected with what you said, especially around kind of, in a sense, how secularity impacts the ideal of American religion. If you look at kind of transatlantic Christianity, I can't remember the historian, but he pointed out that, largely from the arrival of the modern world, there are like the normative religious expressions. Take Anglicans, right, of any part of Europe. Then you have the dissenters in those areas, and then you have those that are driven, that have awakened spirituality, that think great awakenings and such. And if you look at who ends up in America and then who thrives, it's the awakened kind of religious expressions. And the features of these kind of heart religions that a couple of historians pointed to was the uncompromising intensity and disdain for structures. Mm-hmm. Now, what you're saying there kind of resonated with an idea I was thinking about, the way secularity becomes identified in a culture like America that's so shaped by awakened style religion, is where there's a lack of inherent zeal within the perspective. Like this lack of zeal is inherently problematic for the awakened perspective. So secularity is a lack of zeal. And just think of the kind of criticisms evangelicals put towards mainline Protestants, right? Like our lack of zeal. I don't know if they're really Christians. Or they look at Catholics and they're like, well, I don't know. Like, and like seeing that, it's almost as if the description of the way spirituality shows back up in America under a secular age is under the awakened perspective, right? So be authentic. You have to find your own path. And what is the authenticator of its source is you, because that's the only authority you have left. And then you realize you're a sham, so you feel guilty about it. That I just feel bad. I don't know how you feel about those connections, but it does just make me feel bad, right, for how much pressure we have to thrive and succeed and bear this burden. And we don't have communities in the broad or narrow sense who even have it within themselves to speak blessings over us that are more true than we can muster to think about ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had this experience last summer trip where we were in Europe, which I know you're taking your family. So a long European voyage here in a few months. And we were in Paris, right? We got in just a week after they allowed people in. And we were staying by the Sorbonne in a little Airbnb, and pretty right down the street from the Pantheon. And when we got there, the last night we were going to be there, they still had a curfew at like midnight. And the last night we were going to be there, the curfew was going to be over. There would be no more curfew. So that night we thought we would stay up all like at least until 2-3 in the morning and, hang out on the Seine and, have a great time. And yet we got too tired and we had to travel back the next day. So we ended up, back in our room by 10 or 11. But I had to find in a classic Paris style too, like the metro station we needed was going to be closed. So I had to find another metro station. So I was walking and I found this metro station and I walked back up last chance to look at the Pantheon before going. And I stood in front of the Pantheon as the sun set, and there was a statue to my right, and I walked to it, and I knew who it was even before I got there, and it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right there, a big statue of Rousseau. And there were just young people everywhere. There was just young people everywhere with drink wine. It was the first night out of curfew. They were going to party all night long. And there was this really interesting experience where all these kids were sitting on the Rousseau statue and the benches around the Rousseau statue. And they had a wireless speaker, and they were listening to music and drinking. And it was the Bon Iver song. And it was from his second album. I can't remember the name of the song, but the refrain of the song is, "For once I knew I was not magnificent." And these kids would sing it, like they would just be kind of talking. And as soon as that refrain would come on, they would sing. And for once I knew I was not magnificent. And it was fascinating because they were singing at the foot of Rousseau, who was kind of made the assertion, or at least starts us down the road of remembering that the self is fundamentally magnificent, and what corrupts the self is society, that naturally the self is quite magnificent. And I do think that this is part of the issue of these new spiritualities we have, is that the self is supposed to be magnificent, and you're supposed to always do these magnificent elements of the self, and we feel guilty in the midst of trying to perform that magnificence, that we fall down and it doesn't happen. And I do wonder if there is, this is my kind of theology of the cross perspective, probably coming up theologically, but when you look at like the Rhineland mystics that impact Luther, there's a certain assertion from Meister Eckhart to John Thaler to the Frankfurter who writes the Theological Germanica, is that the self is not magnificent, that the self is in need of something outside the self to save it, that the self has to actually confess its unmagnificence, that its need for encounter with something beyond. So my point is when we start with a presumption of the self being magnificent, we not only enter into that kind of really hurried sense of trying to justify that magnificence, but our forms of spirituality become a kind of transcendence that's either internal, it's what I create and what I feel, or it's external in the sense of what I do in the world, how I impose myself on the world. It almost never becomes a kind of in-breaking transcendence, a kind of outside transcendence that encounters us. It's either what the self does to the world or what the self feels about itself. And I just wonder if that's the kind of conversion experience we need. And maybe this is just too much of my kind of Lutheran pseudo-reformed kind of theological perspective, but do we need to say a thumbs up to the spirituality, but the spirituality that the church and Christian ministers have to kind of look at supporting is one that has a different relationship to the self, that does make a confession that the self is not inherently magnificent, that it is not a performing self, that it needs a conversion, it needs an encounter with something outside of it.
No, I think that's really important, and something, right, like that idea may not even be regularly stated in Christian communities, that the human predicament, sin. Right. But it's not just even something that I think is connected to your theology of the cross. I this semester teaching philosophy of religion at the University of Edinburgh, and like of the 40 people in the 2 classes, I think 6 are Christian. The others are all sorts of different religions or none. And this came up because a number of the secular spiritual types doing science, religion, philosophy of religion class wanted to make these kind of affirmations about like the inherent goodness of the human being and this kind of spiritual quest, and also at the same time having a reductive metaphysical commitments. Anyway, that triggers trip. But there was this fascinating exchange where a Hindu student responds to them and goes, I have no idea what I would have to do to convince myself of such a cheery picture of human beings. And it leads to this discussion where basically everyone of every religion is saying one of the best things they love about it is you have to admit human beings, one, we're not transparent to ourselves, and the more honest we are, the more we recognize we're broken and things, and that it's precisely in the context that you are stuck in this predicament that the beauty and wisdom of the tradition emerges, right? So, you're going to Luther style do the like saint and sinner, but that dichotomy or that play is at the heart of all the wisdom traditions in different ways. And when you look at the spirituality being generated by neoliberal capitalism and a pluralistic context that then forces the individual to answer the big questions, it's like we can't manage to be honest about how screwed up we are as humans, because then it falsifies the kind of allegiance we need to have to the nation state, to the market, and it undermines the rationality that justifies so much of the shaping systems of our world.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a kind of Foucaultian kind of reality here too, which is to kind of see how this works and to think about this power that kind of the self unto the self is you have to kind of Foucault's point is you kind of have to look at where the apparatus of punishment is, so when you look at like sovereign power and the king's power, the apparatus of punishment is the king, and that happens in public, completely disclosed to everyone. So Anne Boleyn loses her head right in the square, like everyone sees it. And and Foucault goes through these different forms of power, but he says in a biopolitics, in a kind of neoliberal age, the apparatus of punishment is yourself. You punish yourself. That the whole apparatus of punishment is not outside you in sovereign power or even disciplinary power. It is yourself. You punish yourself all the time. And this is I don't think we've really in theology and spirituality and kind of thinking about spirituality and in Christian ministry have really wrestled enough with how diabolical this system is, that the apparatus of punishment has been taken into yourself. So you punish yourself, and the only way you can receive mercy is from yourself. And so somehow yourself is guilty, and yet it has to be magnificent enough to forgive itself while punishing itself. You're just so trapped in yourself here. And in some sense, this is a kind of Charles Taylor point of, you have to like marvel at the system, like even though it's diabolical and potentially evil, like marvel that this kind of system exists. Like when he says this kind of secular age we've gotten to where God is just an option is an incredible achievement. And he doesn't mean that as a necessarily good thing, but it's crazy that this has happened. In the same way, the neoliberal biopolitics, as Foucault says, is an incredible accomplishment to turn the apparatus of punishment into the self, that you feel guilty every day, that you are failing, that you're the only one who can forgive yourself, but you're guilty to yourself. And the only way you can find mercy is by learning how to forgive yourself, though you feel constantly guilty to yourself, and that no one else is really watching you and holding you accountable to this, but you yourself are doing this. That's no wonder you need some kind of spirituality, some kind of mindfulness, some kind of breathing app on your watch to help you cope with the constant anxiety that you are falling behind, that others are performing the self better than you are, that in all of those kind of things, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I
ran out of steam right there. Did you notice that? I just kind of
no.
ran right out of steam.
You look, you're doing great, Andy. I just want to
thank you. I want you to all know I'm performing myself really well. I'm afraid you don't all think I'm
encouraging you to become all you can be. And so there, these are shorter than a homebrewed Christianity podcast episode. So I have 2 more questions.
Okay, all right.
And you can pick which topic we do first, so that you get your energy back for your crescendo. Okay.
Okay.
I want to talk about how this description changes how we ask the question of the good life.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that, and then and you can pick which one you want to go first, but I also want to talk about how this changes us thinking as parents about passing on we want our children to have a spiritual existence, to connect to our religious tradition and things. How does this kind of critical reflection help us think about our task as parents?
Yeah, maybe we'll start with the parent one. Okay. I think if you're a middle class person inside a kind of new form of middle class, which I think the new middle class in the late moments here of neoliberalism is a very cultured class, a la AndrewRoot, and therefore it's not a leveled class where more and more people are coming into it. It's a class that's keeping people out and kind of has a culturalized kind of form. Do you buy the right products? Do you signal the right virtues? Are you helping your kid get into the best educational institutions that they can, starting with preschool, things like that. I think it's really easy in kind of thinking about parenting inside of helping our kids, first of all, claiming that they're magnificent and then trying to help them compete in this. It's really easy to give them a kind of spirituality that I think is really present in our time, which is it's a spirituality of the inner genius or the spirituality of heroic action. And those become the kind of spiritualities that we uphold. Like, and I do think, this is a whole, we should do a podcast on this, because I'm I'm trying to write on this now, thinking of these mysticisms that these kind of secular spiritualities and mysticisms that form. And I do think they're everywhere, but most of them are these kind of exclusive humanist spiritualities that really are about finding the inner genius within you. And there's different pathways within those, but that's a main one. And then the other one is a more kind of counter enlightenment one, which is the heroic action, what the heroic action you take. And I think the way we tend to form our children is that we give them those kind of spiritualities. Even Christian people give those kind of spiritualities of finding the inner genius, of finding your most inner you, or acting upon the world in this kind of heroic way. And I just wonder if the kind of spirituality that we need within Christian ministry, the kind that really transforms, is more of a kind of confession surrender kind of spirituality. And I think for middle-class parents inside this new competitive middle class, it's very hard. You want your kid to have a spirituality, but it's very hard to see spirituality as surrender and confession, to make the assertion that at once I knew I was not magnificent. So yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of as a cultural meme, if you will, where this often the performative self gets pushed on and continues to kind of colonize us is through our parenting style. Absolutely, through our parenting style. We all want our kids to find their inner genius and be willing to take these heroic actions of the self, and confession and surrender seem completely oppositional to being a good parent, but it may be necessary. It really may be necessary, I think. And I guess that connects to your good life. Oh, go ahead, Trip.
Oh, no. I was going to say, I think that's it's really important to notice that, right?
Mhm.
Because I mean, I have this feeling, and it got more intense in lockdown, where, you know, I know what it looks like to be in a family where I now have more opportunities, where there's generations where each generation had more opportunities than the one before it. And I feel like that my generation are the first ones, at least in Fuller's and the kind of middle class my family at life had experienced, where I don't believe that's true. And now you have like the boomer parents freaking out, like, what kind of advice do we give you? You got student loans, you keep it moving, all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I have kids, and I'm going, do I want to teach them how to win at a game that I think is killing my soul?
Yeah.
Like I don't know what to do with that. And then that's why I think the question of the good life is so important, because I've experienced so much that the good life is something that we get when we retire.
Yeah.
And in order to get there, we just got to keep going, and we got to stay ahead. Like, do we have to grow? Just stay where we are. And it gets perpetually deferred. And then you sit there with all the angst that generates and go, am I succeeding as a parent if I teach my kids how to win at the neoliberal game? And I want them to. And I sit there, like, to me, that's one of those times where I go, Jesus, like, was real clear about that the love of money.
Yeah.
You can serve God or you can serve mammon. Jesus never was like shooting down other actual religions in an either or statement. But when it goes to the allegiance of money and the kind of power that it gives you in culture, it's like, well, you kind of have to decide. And I feel like as a parent, knowing the kind of burden and kind of sickness of soul, because I've done good at this game, I'm like, do I really want them to do this?
Yeah.
Like, would I like Elgin, who's 14 now, to do good enough in high school so that he could come back and go to the University of Edinburgh because it's, you know, such a prestigious school? And that would open up a better master's program than mine, because I had to be the best to get into the master's program I got into, that then set up for the PhD, that then I got a more prestigious postdoc. And like, he could be ahead of that. And then, wow, I've won as a parent, because he too can defer the good life until he's 75 or 80 and done paying for his student loans. Anyway, like,
Right.
I think they're intimately connected.
Yeah. They're absolutely intimately connected in my mind too. And maybe you got this figured out, Trip, but what's so diabolical is you don't want that for Elgin. But what's the alternative? what is the alternative? And maybe there is a kind of certain form of a hyper spirituality that is an alternative, which is, you go live on a farm and you completely get off the grid, and there becomes like this kind of ecological spirituality to do that. But it's that in itself takes a whole lot of privilege to be able to do. In some ways it means you have to kind of live off the backs of some people who won in that neoliberal game to be able to do that often, so that's what seems to me to be so diabolical about the system, is there's not a lot of alternatives. And so, I mean, I just wonder if one of the ways to start to break that open is to think again, and for us to start thinking about spiritualities, and the church to hold the forms of spirituality that do make the confession, like Bon Iver, at once I knew I was not magnificent. What would that be? And could we help our kids like not feel the utter pressure? I mean, I'm the worst of sinners here. I think my 17-year-old son feels utter pressure all the time, often from me to win, to do well, to have his self be something that we feel proud of, or something, and we keep saying that that's not the issue, but I think he gets that from some places. And there is a certain freedom, I think, a certain kind of legitimate freedom to be able to confess that the self is not magnificent, and that we need a gift, we need an encounter from outside of us to save us. And maybe that does rework the good life. What is the good life inside taking on practices of kind of confession and surrender? And so, yeah, like my project of late that I'm working on is kind of looking at memoirists as the new mystics of our time. The memoir often is like the spiritual text of our kind of secular age. And the ones that I rework the good life in a much more humane way are the ones that are not embedded in the church, but are able to go through confession and surrender. And they usually are memoirs of addiction, of people who go through addiction, and they have to confess that the self is not magnificent, and all the performances that they've been under have hurt others and hurt themselves, and they need something outside of them. They need a higher power. They need surrender to ritual and practice to find their way into a good life. And at the center of that good life is always the continued confession that you're an alcoholic or that you're a drug addict, that which is the confession that the self cannot save itself, that no performance, that all the performances of the self, at least for the addict, have become a prison. They become diabolical.
Yeah. I've absolutely enjoyed this conversation. I'm tempted to double its length, but that will be a violation of online summit rules. But if you've enjoyed getting to meet Andy, then go check out, there's a whole series of books on exploring this work on the secular age, social acceleration and such, for ministers, for congregations, for the task of faith and such. So check those out. You can always go find he and I talking on the internet, plenty of places. Is there any particular invite, like some of the projects you're working on, you want someone to know about?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, new book just came out called Churches in the Crisis of Decline that people can find. And working on a Lilly grant that's called From Relevance to Resonance, that you can Google that, and you see a website for that. And yeah, just really always a pleasure to talk with you, Trip, and to be part of the summit. It's been great. So thanks for having me.